leaders are reluctant to communicate when the information is incomplete. And as leaders, I think we sort of get caught in our own minds about feeling like we have to have all the answers. And really, it's the exact opposite of that. As soon as we can start with what's true and start to bring people along, we should start and build along the way.
Have you ever been in a situation where you needed to be able to communicate a message, but you hesitated because you didn't have all the answers? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to Women Leaders on the Move, a HerCsuite radio podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Benamou, and every week I bring you inspirational ideas and conversations with leaders that will help you navigate what's next in your career and your life. Today's guest is Jennifer Lentner. She is a very special guest for me personally. We've known each other over 2 decades. We collaborated on the biggest project that I've ever worked on in my career, and it has been an incredible journey to still be not only in touch, but she's a valued member in HerCsuite. We're going to talk about her journey and also how she helps executives navigate the incredibly difficult position of having to communicate messages in times of constant change. I can't wait for you to hear all about her becoming the founder of Soundtrack and more. So let's get started now. Jennifer, I'm so excited to welcome you to Women Leaders on the Move today. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Natalie. It's so great to see you.
I can't wait for this conversation because you are doing some really interesting things with your business and you've had this career that was different than what you're doing now. So we're going to talk about both. And I want our listeners to get to know you. And right before we came on, we were trying to remember, is it 22 years that we've known each other? Over 2 decades. And so I've had the benefit of getting to know you and know you. But for our listeners who are curious, can you talk a little bit about the transition of going from where you were to what you're doing today?
So I started my career on the engineering side of the business and, went through a lot of different functions of the business. I worked in IT, I worked in marketing, I worked in operations, and I eventually found my way to communications. And I didn't set out to build a career in communications. But what happened was in all those other stops, I got a really deep understanding of how the pieces of the business fit together and how the people in the business fit together. And we were going through a crazy amount of change at the time. We were growing like crazy. And what I've learned is when businesses are growing, things are changing. And we started to experience some change fatigue. And I started to raise my hand and say, we hire really smart people. Why don't we explain to them what's going on? Even if they didn't love this change we have to make, I think they'll understand it. And after saying that one more time than maybe necessary, somebody said, well, why don't you give that a try? See if you can and make that work. And so I spent the next, over half of my career building that function and scaling it as we grew the business and as the business grew and evolved. And after about 15 years of that, my role was changing again. And I decided it was a good time to take the opportunity to see what was next. And I went out and started my own business to help other companies do that same thing.
I think it's so interesting about starting, with a background of engineering and then moving into communication. And I would guess that you always had that in you, the communication piece. That's why it was not a huge leap tremendously for you. But now going from that corporate role into being an entrepreneur, that was a bigger change because you go from meetings constantly and running and always having things going on to maybe not as much at the beginning, right? What was that like for you? What did that feel like when you first left? Sometimes I tell people it's a little bit like a cliff. It's like you're in the forest and there's no sound.
It feels like free fall a little bit for a little bit of time. It's different for sure because you're used to some degree to the work coming to you, right? Of course, it's up to you to build your strategy and to be in tune with what's going on in the business and to be, suggesting and setting direction. But to some degree, the work comes to you based on what's happening in the business. And when you go out on your own, you have to seek that out in a way that you don't have to seek it out when you're in this, structure of the corporate environment. And so figuring out how to do that is probably the biggest learning in moving from one spot to the other. And you're right, it was a way bigger difference than any other change because within that corporate career, every change that I made was a stepwise change, even if it was a significant shift. So it was just a completely new world to learn to operate in.
You know, it's really interesting. I think back to when I left my corporate role, and for whatever reason, and I always managed my own calendar. I didn't have someone, but I had account managers that were kind of like keeping everything running behind the scenes. And I had a lot of trouble with my calendar. I don't know what it was. And I remember talking to one of our advisors at the time, Roz Asheroff, who has an amazing person that helps her with her calendar. And I was like, I don't know how to I don't know why I can't get the hang of this. It's like not that, but that was just one example that I hear from a lot of women that, all of a sudden you don't have that infrastructure. And were there things like that where you had this infrastructure that maybe it was not a calendar, but there's other things that you're kind of running and now it's like, "Oh, no, that's all under my umbrella."
The thing that probably was the biggest shift for me and is, the sort of the groundwork for when you're out on your own is the networking piece. When you're within the corporate structure, that networking a lot of times, I don't wanna say it happens on its own, but you don't have to seek it out in quite the same way because you're networking all the time in a corporation to figure out, who needs what and how to get your work done, but most of it happens in the company. But there's no shortage of opportunities to network. I mean, there were 40,000 employees at the company that I worked for, right? I mean, there's lots of networking opportunity. But what I found is that, then when I left, a lot of my network was in that corporate structure, and I had not been cultivating that externally to the degree that, in retrospect, I wish I had been. And so I had to learn how to do that on my own and figure out, where to plug in and how to plug in and how to make the best of that time that you spend on that. And it's more to manage than you think because it's another one of those things that just sort of comes to you when you're in that corporate structure.
Yeah, I'm thinking back because, of course, where we met was trade shows. Your organization did a really great job of maximizing the time that people were coming together, right? But that was still that internal piece, right? You're still like everyone's getting together internally. Do you think that would be an opportunity if people are thinking about this and they're listening and they haven't left their corporate to think about if you are going to conferences, if you are booked, you're booked 18 hours and we know that. But there's also the associations that can be a great place. Were you involved in any of those? I know that some of your team, some people on your team were involved in that and that kind of branched out a little.
Yeah, I was not especially involved in any of those. My team was, to your point, but I do think that that's a great opportunity. And when I think back on it, there are a couple of different ways to take advantage of that opportunity. One is you think about in any industry, people move around and people that might have been in your network at your company before are now other places. And so now we're all in one location for a few days and, to think about proactively, could you take the time to connect with a couple of those people while you're all in one location? You bump into them on the show floor and you're glad to see each other, but at that moment you can't do anything about having coffee or lunch. Everybody's scheduled. But to proactively think about who might be in New Orleans while we're there and who could you catch up with, I think that's one of the biggest opportunities, and there are some of those association opportunities to meet other people that do what you do, and a lot of times there's some structure there to do that if you can take the time, but a lot of times what happens on your own show floor sort of creeps in and that gets lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, absolutely. So now in this new place that you are today, designing what this looks like, what are the things that you're really excited about with taking this new role and going out and exploring what is next for you?
The thing I'm really excited about, Natalie, is getting to do the work that I most love to do, more of it, and to do it with companies that are in that stage that my company was in when I started doing the work. We were going through that crazy fast growth. We were scaling a lot of things. A lot of systems have to change. If your communication doesn't scale with that, that's when you start to struggle. And that's what I had the chance to work on in that back half of my corporate career, and I'm really excited to work with companies that are on the front end of that to help them navigate that process and build something that'll support their growth.
I'm thinking about for the audience wondering, is it manufacturing? Is it agnostic to what the company is doing, but it's that change piece? Where are you in that space?
Really, it's industry agnostic in my mind. The communication skills, I think, are very transferable. You, of course, have to learn about that company, about that industry, but you have to do that when you're working in that corporate structure anyway. You have to be able to drop into a situation and learn what's the situation, what are the conditions that are driving this, what are the specifics, and build around that. So that piece picks up and drops in pretty much any place that you go. So for me, the focus is more on those growing companies that are growing through M&A and are, need a strategy for how they onboard those people and bring them into this new culture and make that a productive, new company, or leaders that are transitioning into a higher profile role within a company, and they need to think about how do they build their relationship with their employees who may not know of them or may know them from a different context, and they have to think differently about how they humanize themselves to those employees so that they understand, what drives this leader, what are their hot buttons, what keeps them up at night, who am I following? And that's really important as you go through change and things are hard, to know who you're following and why you should want to follow. And so I really enjoy, working with leaders that are working through that. And then, of course, there's the day to day, strategy and execution around communicating in a growing business. So all three of those things, those are really my focus. And so those companies that are at an inflection point in their growth, whether they're, going from a startup to a little bit bigger, or whether they're, a mid-market company that's just at that next step change, really it's that inflection point in that transition that's the sweet spot for me.
And all the things that you're talking about are, in my mind, human to human conversations. I think people, and we talk about this a lot in our entrepreneur group about AI. I'm, as you know, obsessed with it. But I think in this context, we're talking about people, how they feel, what their experience is, where's the gap. And as much as the tools are out there, that human connection is really so critical. What are you seeing in that area of how people are either relying too much or not enough, or are they still staying in the lane of understanding the human centric is still the key to culture?
A lot of the companies that I work with are in a transition point where their leader has to go from one to one communication to one to many. So maybe they've been in an environment where they can walk around, management by walking around, and they're talking to people and hearing what their concerns are and talking to them about what's going on in the business. And now they can't get to everybody anymore. They've, either acquired a company in another location, or there's just too many. And so that's the transition that they're going through, and a lot of those leaders are reluctant to shift how they communicate because they don't want to lose that one to one connection. Where that ties to AI for me is that they aren't necessarily looking to go from that to AI, driving their communication, because they're already concerned about losing that human connection. So where I think AI comes into that, however, is a lot of times what I will see is, my clients will come to me when we're working on, a plan for something or strategy for something, and they'll say, I plugged my thoughts into AI and this is what I got. And this is what I do or don't like about it. And so that gives us a really great starting place for the conversation. And so we can drop right into that piece of the conversation versus starting at the very beginning. And so that's where I'm starting to see it come into these companies that are, going through this transition of how they communicate, is that they're using it to just sort of get through that messy first draft. And that's where I find the value in it for myself as well. Is, let's skip all of that blank sheet of paper sort of spinning and get down to what we really want people to understand.
It's so good to use it as a tool like that and not as the end all. Some days I feel like I've rewritten something so many times. I'm like, why did I even bother? I should have just written it from scratch. And other times I'm like, oh, thank you for that idea. Now I can take it and go. So it's never perfect. When you are in that position where you're solving, what are some trends that you're seeing that leaders are facing right now in terms of that communication piece? Or you mentioned M&A earlier. What are some of those things that you're seeing today that they are struggling with or facing?
Well, I mean, the first, like I said, is that, making that shift from one to many is challenging. I think the other thing is just so many things are changing so quickly around us, and employees are they're trying to reason through that themselves, right? And so they might be concerned or anxious about it, or they just might not understand it. And that's hard when you're in a leadership role because I think a lot of times as leaders, we feel like people look to us to know all of the answers. And so figuring out how to know all of the answers when things are changing so rapidly and so much is new is hard. And I sometimes see leaders become reluctant because they feel like they don't have all the answers and so they don't want to say anything, either because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing or they're afraid it's going to open up questions they don't know how to answer yet, or because they think people expect them to know all of the answers. And really, what it comes down to, and where I try to help them get, is understanding that people don't need perfection. They want direction and context. And so, if you think of it like that, you always have something to say and something that can help move people forward just that next step. And if you tell people this is what we know and this is what we don't, and this is how you'll learn more, and then you follow up, make sure you follow up on that promise, you can actually build more trust with your employees by starting sooner and saying, we don't know, there's a lot we don't know right now, than if you wait and have more answers. Because silence just gives time for uncertainty to creep in, and silence doesn't reduce the uncertainty that you have, it just transfers it to your team. And so, when you start with what's true now and tell people how they'll learn more, generally that is a really virtuous cycle, and it'll build more trust than if you're worried about, leaving some gaps.
What's coming to mind is that transparency piece to me, where when you know what direction you're going in, when you know the North Star and you can articulate that, there's a lot of things underneath. But if the company at least has that, like we're going here, there's a bunch of steps that are going to happen that are, we may have to go over here a little bit, but this is our direction. And then people can align to that goal. It's when you don't have that North Star and there's all this stuff going on sideways that people are like, I don't know. Are we doing this? Are we doing that? Are we? And I think one of the hardest things is people can adapt to change, but if you change too fast all the time, it's unsettling. It's like you're walking on hot lava, right? You're like, "Wait a second. Today, yesterday I had a bridge and now the bridge is gone and it's all like I don't have the bridge anymore." What do you do when it's that kind of scenario where it's so rapid that it's hard to have the wood planks to get across the ravine or whatever. What are some things that people can you were talking about those micro, adjustments, but maybe from an employee perspective, if they're looking to the leader, what are some questions they should ask?
And I think you started to say it when you were talking about the direction, right? And so if you can paint a picture for people about, here is our strategic plan, or here are our, top three objectives, or this is who we want to be. Every company is in a different phase of, developing that and what they're ready to articulate. So if, to your point, if you can paint that North Star and talk about here are the things we're pursuing to get there, then as you come to them with these changes, you can tie them to that and say, this piece that we said was critical to us achieving our mission of this supports that. And so if they can tie those pieces and then you come back and tell them, how are we doing? We said 90 days ago that we were making this change and this is why. Here's how we're progressing. And that thing you saw over here was tied to that. Sometimes people see lots of pieces and they're related, but they just can't tie them all together. And so if you can tell them what's related, all of a sudden it starts to seem like it fits in versus feeling like a change in direction. Those pieces can feel unrelated and like each one of them is a left turn, or they can feel like they're part of a bigger solution. And really, I think it's tying those things together that help people to weather that change, because otherwise it feels like you're changing your mind all the time. And that's where people really start to get fatigued and to resist change and say, well, I'm just going to hold on. I'm not going to even engage in that until I see if we're serious or if that's going to work. Where if they understand where it fits, sometimes it looks a lot different to them.
I think you lose a little credibility depending on the size of the company. If you're, this month we're doing this, and then next month it's, a startup is different, because you have to adjust to kind of you're figuring it out in real time. I could just say that, and you've witnessed it. But for bigger companies, that mid cap kind of size and bigger, if you are not anticipating or seeing forward, there is always changes. It's a constant. So we know this to be true. And so I think giving people the tools. And I love that circle back that you mentioned earlier of like, okay, it's one thing to tell people this is North Star and then you're doing things, but then ask the question. So do you think about this in terms of all hands, or how are you suggesting people communicate that?
The important thing is that you are doing it in steps and you're revisiting it and you're doing it in a number of different modes, right? People receive information differently. So some people appreciate an email and some people appreciate a video and some people appreciate an all hands meeting. And so it's important to really look at who are your stakeholders and how do you reach each of them, and to make sure that you're touching on all of those points without overwhelming people with just way too much communication. But if you're really looking at who are your stakeholders and what's it important for them to understand and how do we reach them in a few different ways and at different points in the process, then that gradually starts to build up a cadence and people start to understand what to expect in that way as well. And so then when this information comes at them through that mechanism that you've put in place and that you've used consistently, that also starts to fill in the blanks as well, right? So, really it's about thinking about how people receive the information and making sure that they have more than one touch point and that there's something that's accessible to everybody. And really the other piece of it is to make sure that there are opportunities for two-way conversation, right? So there's a lot of push of information as there needs to be, but there have to be ways for that to be a two-way conversation as well, so that people have the opportunity to give feedback and ask questions.
Yeah, and I think as we keep moving to and from and in between in person, hybrid, virtual, and that all plays a part too. If you've been in person and then you go to hybrid or virtual and now you're being asked to come back and there's all those different, or maybe you came back and then they decide, oh no, you know what? We really liked it virtual. It was better. That is one of the unsettling pieces, I think, as both a leader and an employee, right? What are you suggesting to those leaders that are leading those kinds of things, of how do they communicate in those three buckets? Is it like a cadence every week, or how often what have you seen to really be successful?
Yeah, I think the important thing is, to your point, you've got in-person communication, live one-on-one. You've got whether it's hybrid where there's a virtual option or whether it's asynchronous, it's video that you can consume when you're ready, or whether it's written communication, that the complexity of the mechanism is aligned to the frequency, right? So, we did in-person all hands quarterly. And then when we would say, to the degree that you can schedule yourself to be in person on those days, that feels achievable because you're not asking somebody to be in the office every week on Tuesday at 10 o'clock to receive this information. The things that come out regularly, we would take to a different mechanism, something that's either a newsletter or a video or something that can be, consumed at the employee's, discretion and when they had time to do that. And that we also gave some, like I said, opportunities for that to be a two-way conversation. And so really we just would look to say, what is the thing that happens the most often and make that the easiest for people. The other thing is to really make sure that the mechanisms that you put in place go with a frequency that equals how fast the information you put in them change, right? So I'll have a leader say, or somebody say, well, we need a weekly newsletter. And say, well, okay, maybe you do. What do you want to put in it? And how fast does that information change? Are we going to talk about business results or business updates? How many orders did we take last week? And, how did production do last week? Well, that once a week makes sense. If we're going to talk about financials, those don't change necessarily week to week. So make sure we align that so that it isn't the same message repeated four times before it changes. Or we keep coming back and saying, we don't have anything to report this week. We don't have anything to report this week. And then that mechanism loses credibility because it feels like there's never anything in it. So really it's just a matter of kind of, matrixing that out and making sure that you've got those things aligned to how fast the information changes and who's on the receiving end.
One last question for you, because I can obviously talk to you all day. I love talking with you. If you're a leader in the midst of all of this, what is one thing they can kind of keep them grounded as they're thinking about their communication? Is there one thing that they should just always keep in the back of their mind?
I think the biggest thing that people should keep in mind is that it doesn't have to be complicated to give context. So it can be very simple and very basic, and you don't have to know all of the answers. Start with what's true, start with what's simple, and then come back when you've got more and give employees a chance to tell you how that helped or didn't help and tell you what their questions are. And before you know it, you'll be making good progress.
I love that. I'm so glad that you were here today. I love our conversation. Like I said, I could talk to you. I'm just fascinated by communication. Everything comes down to communication, everything, because when good communication happens, things flow and business thrives and people's relationships improve. If people want to connect with you, Jennifer, where should they go?
They can find me on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, I will have that. And I'll also have a link to your website in our show notes. And thank you for being on the show today. I loved our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. It was great to be with you.
Thank you for spending your time with us today. If you enjoyed the conversation I had today with Jennifer, you can meet her in our entrepreneur program in her C suite, where we do business with each other. That is the purpose of our entrepreneur mastermind. I would love to invite you to check it out and schedule a call with me if you have any questions. I'd like to hear what success looks like for you. And if you found the advice that Jennifer gave today helpful, it would be amazing if you would rate and review the show and share it with a friend or colleague. That would be even more amazing. Keep shining your light bright. The world needs you.